Shalom from Israel. I'm Sorko-Ram, and I want to welcome you to Israel Frontline, your guide to Israel and the Middle East. We want to give you a biblical perspective on the political and social current events in Israel as they happen. What you will hear on this broadcast will contrast sharply with the biased reporting we are receiving from most of the world media. This is the last episode in our 4-part series about Jerusalem. Today, we will examine what are narratives and why are they important, also looking into the reasons why Palestinians are trying to discredit the Jewish narrative about Jerusalem, inventing their own history. On the program today, what is a narrative? The narratives of Jerusalem. Narrative clashes. Finally, our panel of Israeli guests will share their perspectives regarding Jerusalem and Israel's struggle to preserve its biblical narrative. When we watch the news, we generally believe the facts reported are true. When we discuss matters such as Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we expect to find the facts that will give us the understanding we seek. What if I were to tell you that here in Israel, the biggest disagreements are all about the facts? Both sides have a version of the truth that they claim is factual and complete. These different perspectives of the facts are known as narrative. Today, we'll discuss the concept of narrative and how it has become a crucial part of the discussion of Jerusalem's history. The word narrative is simply the report of events. In the political context and the study of social sciences, narrative refers to the story each people tell about themselves and the way they tie history into that simplified story. Here's an example. The Israeli narrative would include the following ideas. We are the chosen people of the Bible. We were slaves in Egypt and were led by Moses to our promised land. Now we have returned to our ancestral land from exile and have been victorious over our enemies. We've managed to set up a successful nation, supported by our unique traditions and values. You notice this is a very simple story, which looks at events through a limited scope and provides a tool with which the group can explain history. In Jerusalem, the matter of narrative is a serious one. For the Jewish people, Jerusalem is their ancestral capital. The biblical stories of the Jewish kings and the Temple Mount are foundational to the Jewish perspective regarding the city. The Palestinians claim an opposite story. In the current Palestinian narrative of Jerusalem, the Kingdom of David is a Jewish fairy tale. King Solomon's temple never existed, and Jesus is the first Palestinian. This is not a joke. Their narrative is a serious attempt to rewrite the Jewish people out of history. And it is believed by 1.6 billion Muslims all around the world. The narrative debate is not limited to an academic discussion. This is a battle being fought literally under the ground, in construction sites and archaeological digs around Jerusalem. Here's an example of how significant a matter this is. The Waqf, the Muslim religious authorities who run the Temple Mount, performed a series of excavations under the Al-Aqsa Mosque starting in the late 1980s till just a few years ago. During those excavations, they removed hundreds of truckloads of earth from the Temple Mount. They dumped the excavated material in a nearby landfill, in what scholars and archaeologists have called an intentional destruction of evidence of the Jewish temples. Israeli scholars dug through the rubble and collected the discarded materials. They found in it artifacts from the first and second temples. The Waqf responded by grinding the material to rubble in subsequent excavations, so nothing more could be found in it. The Palestinians have even gone farther than that. A group of people who didn't exist 100 years ago is now claiming they have been here in the land even before Joshua crossed the Jordan River. Their attempts at this are a bit clumsy. They claim to be both Philistines and also the Jebusites, even though all of the ancient peoples of Canaan, such as the Philistines, the Jebusites, and the Canaanites, no longer exist anywhere. That is, none except the Jewish people. Moreover, different leaders in the Palestinian Authority are rewriting their own history. Saeb Erekat, the head of the PLO negotiations team, is currently claiming his family was here in Israel more than 3,000 years ago. He somehow feels no obligation to explain the discrepancy between this story and his official biography, in which he said his family made it to the region 100 or less years ago, like most of the so-called Palestinian people. On the Jewish side of things, archaeological digs which prove the accuracy of biblical stories, such as the tunnels alongside the Western Wall, have been very successful. Over the past years, many discoveries have been made that reinforce the accuracy of the Bible, including proof in several locations of David's kingdom. The city of David, located a few hundred yards to the south of the current walls, has also been excavated and has had countless artifacts found which time after time prove that the Bible is accurate and true. Contrary to the superficial impression, the Arab narrative debate in general, and specifically about Jerusalem, is not actually about history. It is about shaping the present and the future. It is being used as a tool to discredit Israel's legitimacy to control the holy city and the land, and to establish in its place a Palestinian substitute. It is hugely important to understand the nature of this discussion because it frames the entire conflict in the correct perspective, an ideological battle, and not simply a political issue needing resolution. The Palestinians and some in the international community are trying to rewrite history, and Jerusalem is at the forefront of their attempts. If you sample the policies and agendas of the international community regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you will be left with the impression that two stubborn sides are refusing to make simple concessions needed of them, which, if made, would immediately bring peace to the entire region, and along with that, solve the troubles of the Middle East as a whole. This might sound far-fetched, but if you were to follow the U.S. and European foreign policy, especially their responses to events in the region, you would find that for some reason, they've decided to frame all of their interests in the Middle East around the smallest of conflicts, the Israeli-Palestinian one. And the crux of this focus has been Jerusalem. Let's break this down for a moment. Are there other cases in which a country which has been victorious in war is asked by a party who was not even part of the conflict to give up half of its capital? Obviously, the answer is a resounding no. No one has ever thought that the way to solve a conflict of ethnic and religious tension would ever be to ask the most stable party to give up half of its capital to others. In fact, when you compare the attitudes of the international community towards the question of Jerusalem, It's quite clear that this is both an unprecedented approach and that there are hidden causes in the background, a much deeper ulterior motive. This focus and the international pressure seems even less logical when you consider that for decades, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has only been responsible for a very small number of casualties compared to conflicts in the region. In the not-too-distant past, Iraq and Iran suffered over 1 million dead in their war. Even now, civil war is tearing Syria apart. ISIS is executing multitudes of innocents across the Middle East, and yet, somehow, the focus remains on Israel, as if solving this issue will solve all the rest. This should not come as a surprise to you. The prophet spoke of the nations of the world rising up against Israel. Zechariah speaks of the nations surrounding the city of Jerusalem in a military siege until the Lord himself removes that threat with his own army. That's apocalypse. But we still can ask, why would all the nations of the world turn against Israel? What would be the reason for such an event to take place? The Bible does not give us that information, but we can only imagine that it will be a process. It's not likely that a great number of nations will just pick up arms and march on Jerusalem out of the blue. What seems to make sense is that the words of the Lord in the mouth of the prophet are describing the culmination of a process. Nations gradually turning against Israel as they believe the Islamic narrative, developing a hatred and a bias towards Israel that ultimately turns into military force. This is clearly taking place before our eyes through the auspices of the Islamic-driven United Nations. Let's look at the current state of events. We're a small nation of 8 million citizens surrounded by hundreds of millions of Muslims, many of whose military forces and terrorist organizations, such as Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and ISIS, have sworn to destroy us completely. Many nations around the world point their finger at Israel and accuse it of racism, violence, and being responsible for the unrest in these parts of the world, and all of it contrary to available evidence. Putting this into perspective of biblical prophecy makes this all more understandable. Here's some encouragement from the book of Isaiah, where God promises to restore his kingdom in Jerusalem according to his plan before the earth was formed. I will restore your leaders as in days of old, your rulers as at the beginning. Afterward, you will be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city. Zion will be delivered with justice, her penitent ones with righteousness. Stay with us. We will be right back with Mati Shoshani, Shani Ferguson, and Israel Pachter for a discussion about narratives and the importance of Jerusalem and her biblical narrative.
Maoz Israel Ministries is a Messianic Jewish nonprofit organization based in Tel Aviv. We exist to be a witness of the good news to the people of Israel through outreach, discipleship, and raising up godly leaders. We translate and publish outstanding faith books in Hebrew and powerful testimony books to reach non-believers. We have a Hebrew outreach website with original media content produced by our team. We support the Hebrew-speaking congregation Tiferet Yeshua in Tel Aviv. We sponsor and host seminars and conferences. We support our Arab Christian brothers who love Israel and the God of Israel. Our I Stand With Israel Fund serves as a benevolence outreach, meeting the practical needs of Israeli believers Our dream is to see God's promises fulfilled until the day when all Israel will be saved.
Welcome back to Israel Frontline. Our Israeli panel guests have now joined me to answer some questions expanding on the subject of Jerusalem and her narratives. In the studio with me today are Mati Shoshani, Director of Operations for TBN Israel from Jerusalem; Shani Ferguson, co-founder of Yeshua Israel Ministries, also from Jerusalem; and Israel Pachter, pastor of Beit Hallel Messianic Congregation from Ashdod in southern Israel. Welcome and thank you again for being here.
It's good to be here.
Shalom.
Shani, why do journalists, and we've got lots of journalists in Israel, who are paid to do their job accurately, not understand and report that the Palestinians only became a people in the 1960s? How come they don't understand that? And according to numerous historical documents that record the small number of Arabs in the land even 100 years ago, there was no Palestinian people living in the Holy Land. Why do the journalists from all of the big newspapers and networks not know these facts?
I think it's kind of like the question, really, if you look, let's say, at the homosexual community who is now known as gay. If I were to use the term gay in terms of I'm being happy, most people would not understand what I'm saying. They would assume that I mean something else. And I think that's kind of what's happened with the Palestinian people, because there was a Palestinian people here, and it was the Jewish people. They called themselves Palestinian Jews because they are of the region of Palestine, just like you could call yourself a New Englander if you lived up in Boston. So it wasn't a nationality per se, but it did exist. And so what's happened is that that term has been co-opted, and even for us who understand the dynamics, we would still at times refer to them as Palestinian Arabs, only so that people know who we're talking about, not because we recognize them. So just the very fact that you have to use the narrative to explain something is part of the reason that journalists just, continue on with that narrative. Aside from the fact that they would have the agenda of, the pro-Palestinian and the evil Israeli and, things that we've discussed before. But I think the basic issue is that the term itself is very confusing.
But couldn't they just look on the internet or go to a library
and then say what? And then you have to.
Your assumption is wrong, though. Journalists are lazy. I'm dead. Journalists
he knows he's a journalist.
And journalism is lazy. Journalism recycles known material. They like simple stories. Their viewers like simple stories.
Out of context.
They just like they like getting an email that tells them what to write in their article. This is how it works. They're not into they're
not historians.
Maybe they're not being accurate and they're twisting the story. Maybe they've been doing this for years. Perhaps I should go and research this topic and make sure their citation is accurate. They don't care. They just take the document and say, okay, maybe I'll run the story. According to Palestinian sources, Israel did this and that. That's it. That's the end of their work. Not going to go get,
the
relax.
Palestinian used to be, you had the Palestine Symphony, which was largely Jewish musicians. You had the Palestine Post, before it was the Jerusalem Post, was the Palestine Post. So just the term Palestine was, again, just a regional term that's been co-opted.
And of course, the good reports did not sales, not newspapers, not any programs, but the bad reports always much better.
Conflict. And if you have 800 million Arabs or whatever around the world, then there's more of them that will buy articles that are pro-Palestinian than there are those that will buy pro-Israeli magazines or articles. So you can see that the journalists would have a larger audience in the anti-Israel rhetoric.
It goes back farther than the 18th century, though, when we're talking Palestine. The Palestinians have sort of usurped the position of, or the identity of, the Philistines who lived in the land, and even have tried to go back even farther than that, where today, and I think you mentioned this earlier in the show, the Palestinians negotiation team, they're just rewriting their own personal history.
Yes.
Sai Barikat, who's the head of the negotiation team, he says, well, my family's been here since before the time of Joshua. If you say Joshua, was here in the land, I was here before him. And it's a known fact that his family only arrived in the region 100 years ago. But they have no shame in lying about it, they just do, and people assume it. So it's like this, it goes much farther than 200 years back. They're going thousands of years back and say, no, you stole the land from us. Although, again, the Palestinians are more relating to the Arab population that was in the Ottoman Empire. They never were an entity till they were separated from the rest of the Arab world around them.
You almost feel bad for the journalists because the journalists are almost like tourists in this foreign country. When you go to China and like whatever person's going to sit and tell you something, or some country that you've never been to, you're just going to believe whatever they say. You have no way of, kind of identifying their culture.
I would accept that. However, there are journalists who have actually
Correct.
here for years, and they still write the same.
But they may have embraced that
stuff.
rhetoric at the very beginning and just kind of gone with it.
Or they have an ulterior motive.
Correct.
They're
I'm
pro-Palestinian
I'm
or
giving the benefit of the
anti-Zionist
doubt
or-
that there are a
Yeah.
few journalists that are just genuinely lazy and good-hearted.
And some of them are malicious, and they want to promote
Yeah.
an untrue
Right.
story. Yes,
Right.
that is the case. I want to point out a biblical truth, and the fact is that we're talking about narrative, a long-term story. The Jews are the only, when you read the Bible, out of all the people that resided in this region, there's only one that remains today: the Jewish people. The Philistines no longer.
No.
Not the Jebusites or any of these other nations
Moabites.
that are. None of them. None of them remain today, with one exception: the Jewish people.
And it's
that's-
another miracle, biblical miracle.
It's not an accident. This is the intentional hand
Yes.
of God on
Yes.
this land and this people,
Right.
bringing them back to the country.
So, Israel, does this show us that a spiritual war between good and evil is much more significant than most of us realize, in that they are strongly influencing the world's activities?
Oh, for sure. Traveling the world, I can feel in many countries that there's time is not moving. Everything is quiet and normal and good. When you live in Israel, every half an hour you have news, and many times you expect to hear
Something happens
war
every
will
30
start.
minutes. Yeah.
Every minute. So we have tensions here in Israel, a lot of tensions. Why? Because of the Bible. Because God has spoken openly all the prophecies about restoration, but also He warned us what shall come, and one of the nations will come against Israel. And like we said before, it's already on the process, and people will always fight what God is doing. It started, from the days of Adam and Eve and Moses and Jesus, of course. And it's still the fact today. The spiritual world is very real. But because of that, actually, we're doing this program, and we want Christians to know that there is real battle, and it's not only
Yes.
political. Don't buy any news you got on your TV, but check it out. Stick with the Bible.
Exactly.
Check the book.
And Israel senses, when you say threat, people in Israel, in the back of their mind, and this is not, they're not being paranoid or anything like that, there is an existential threat. If our army today were to lay down its weapons, we would be gone. There's no question about it.
Oh, yeah.
We would be off the face of the earth this fast. There's no question about it. So that threat is there. That threat shapes the way our people look at reality. And you can't look at it in a reasonable way. You have to say, there must be something going on here. Why do they even care about us? We're 8 million people. We're a speck of a land. Who cares about what's going on here? But reality is, we see it again and again and again. They keep coming back to us. The world is, is focused on this area, and people hate us and are, almost obsessed with this land in an unreasonable, religious, zealous way. And you have to look and say, well, there must be something more to
Okay,
it.
so we understand there's a real spiritual aspect here. But can you give some maybe practical reasons that the world is so focused? What do they, they're not thinking, okay, this is a spiritual battle. What are some of the practical things or the reality as they see it, that is in the Palestinian conflict, that when there's constant war going on in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya, and all these countries, and yet there is this constant focus, even in the United States, that, like Kerry is over here. The world's falling apart, and Kerry, Secretary of State Kerry, wants to come over here and make peace by dividing up Jerusalem.
John Kerry's got his own agenda. We've talked about this in the past. Not a fan of him at all. But part of it is, I said journalists are lazy. They're lazy because their viewers like simple stories.
Yes.
And no one wants to hear, listen guys, it's not Israel that's the problem. Everywhere around the world is the problem right now. Actually, if you're watching this in America, in your sofa, you have a job, you have food, you're the minority in the world. Most of the people, most of the population of the world doesn't enjoy that freedom, and they're at war. Their people oftentimes are at a struggle, and they don't like hearing that because it would require doing something. This is an easy out. You sit back on your sofa and you say, well, Israel is the problem.
Yeah.
All we have to do is solve that problem, and we're done. That's it. You don't have to worry about anything else in the area.
One of the examples I will tell you, I've been in Europe, just came back from Norway, spoken to the Norwegian, especially young people. And I asked them a question. Do you see any rational explanation why your government or the main movements, they're supporting Palestinian Authority or other, Islamic countries, Islamic states, because inside of the states, inside of those authorities, there is no freedom. Now they are speaking of freedom of speech, freedom of women, freedom of, all of the good stuff from the Europe, and at the same time they're supporting governments who doesn't have it against Israel, kind of making plot and really lots of boundaries. So what is it? And many of them, they answered me, they said, wow, it's not rational, really. Like, what is common between atheists and between...
they secretly admire the Jewish people because they would never hold us to such a standard if they didn't really look at us and say, wow, those are people that could potentially live that standard. They have some sort of like they think we're superhuman or something. Like we can defend ourselves and not kill a single civilian, or somehow exist in a land where nobody wants us and not bother everybody around us.
When I see so much hatred towards Israel, it's hard for me to believe.
No, they don't know. They're not feeling good feelings towards us.
No,
but they simultaneously hate us and still hold us like they view us as something supernatural, because otherwise that's why they don't expect it from Assad in Syria, because they don't view him that way. They may dislike him, they may not like him, they may not like ISIS, but they don't expect them to hold any kind of moral standard. They don't represent any kind of human beauty per se, and so then they just go in and they're like, well, you need to stop what you're doing or whatever, but we know we can't do anything about it.
Confused look, I would say. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for today's Israel Frontline. Thank you for watching. We hope that the information you heard on this program will help you pray for Israel in a more focused way. If you would like to obtain a written copy of the entire 4-part series about Jerusalem, please go to maozisrael.org/Jerusalem for your free copy. We will also send you monthly articles that I have written in the Maoz Israel Report. Don't forget to join us next week for a brand new episode of Israel Frontline. On behalf of our team and myself, blessings and shalom from Tel Aviv.